Okay, Act One, Scene Three, or well, as we might call it in today's language, the mansplaining scene. That term did not exist in Shakespeare's time, of course. If it had, he probably would have invented it. But even though he didn't invent the word mansplaining, Act One, Scene Three of Hamlet still proves that Shakespeare at least knew what it was and knew how to make fun of it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Okay, in terms of broad strokes, when the proverbial, not literal, curtain rises on Act One, Scene Three. What we're expecting to see, what we're anxious to see, is Hamlet hanging out on the battlements with Horatio and the guards, waiting to see whether his dad's ghost shows up. That's how Act One, Scene Two ends, with Hamlet agreeing to hang out with them on the battlements because perchance to walk again tonight. And instead of seeing that, what the last scene psyched us up to see, Shakespeare proves that in addition to being a master of everything else, he's also a master of suspense because he makes us wait for that. Instead, what we get in Act One, Scene Three is the thing that, as far as we know, we care least about. That Laertes dude who we saw for 2 seconds in the last scene saying goodbye to his family before he leaves to go back to college in France. And we also briefly heard from his dad, Polonius, the king's advisor, the king's smithers, in the last scene. And we also meet in this scene Laertes' sister, Polonius's daughter, the what's usually considered the female lead of the play, Ophelia. I say usually because I suppose that's open to interpretation. There are, interestingly, only 2 female characters in the play. Well, whether the player queen is a female or a man dressed as a woman depends on what century you set the play in. But the player queen being sort of ambiguous in that regard, there are only 2 official female characters in the play, Gertrude and Ophelia. Ophelia does speak more lines, but Gertrude is on stage more, in more scenes, appears in fact, twice as many scenes as Ophelia, but often is on stage for scenes where she doesn't talk very much. More on that and then gender and female representation in Hamlet when we get to the end of the scene. So what we've got is sort of, in this brief scene, a little over 100 lines, 3 chunks. We've got Laertes saying goodbye to his sister Ophelia as he's getting ready to board the ship for France. He'll be back later in the play after some stuff happens. Not going to tell you what it is, but he's not happy about it. Then we've got then their dad Polonius comes in, gives advice to Laertes about how to behave himself at college in France. Advice that contains one of the play's more famous lines, "To thine own self be true," probably the most famous line spoken by any character other than Hamlet himself, though I guess Marcellus's "Something is rotten in the state of Denmark," or Gertrude's "The lady doth protest too much, methinks," might vie with it for that title. Then Laertes finally gets on the boat, and Polonius turns to his daughter Ophelia and gives her yet more advice about her private life. So, as we can see, it's a very advice-giving family, the Polonius family, regardless of whether the advice is asked for or not. We are not quite sure yet at this early point in the play why we care about Polonius and his 2 kids. We're anxious to have for night to fall, as Hamlet himself is at this point of the play, anxious for night to fall so we can see whether the ghost shows up again, and if so, what it has to say. But this is Shakespeare introducing the B plot that is in Act 2 and thereafter going to start intersecting with and affecting the main plot with Hamlet and his mom and uncle and dad's ghost. So it's established in these first few lines here that apparently before the play started, Ophelia, the daughter of Polonius, Ophelia and Prince Hamlet had been, they didn't say dating in the Middle Ages, but romantically involved seen to spend time together to have an understanding with each other. For Hamlet, her sister, her brother Ophelia's brother Laertes advises her, for Hamlet in the trifling of his favor, hold it a fashion and a toy in blood, a violet in the youth of primy nature, forward, not permanent, sweet, not lasting, the perfume and suppliance of a minute no more. In other words, don't get too serious with Hamlet. He's probably not serious about you. Now, Ophelia's response, no more but so, is brief, but pointedly delivered. We can hear, even though she says a lot less than the male character, her brother, does, we can instantly hear the tone with which that's supposed to be delivered. No more but so, in other words, hey, do you think I'm so naive that I can be led on so easily by a man who's not serious about me? And this is something we notice about Ophelia, and I suppose also about Gertrude in her scenes, is that the two women characters of the play, the main character's mom and main character's girlfriend, don't get to do nearly as much talking as the male characters do in this play. The male characters, especially Hamlet himself, tend to talk over them. But when they do speak, I guess knowing that they're going to get cut off again in a second or two, they're in the habit of packing a lot of meaning into the brief responses that they give when they do manage to get a word in. So in her brief, no more but so, delivered with the right tone, Ophelia gets in more meaning and more attitude than her brother did in his much longer speech. He apparently takes after their father in terms of taking up more time than he needs to make his point. Seeing that he has offended his sister, Laertes then tries to backpedal, to walk it back. Well, perhaps he loves you now, he says. And now no soil nor coral doth besmirch the virtue of his will, but you must fear his greatness weighed, his will is not his own. For he himself is subject to his birth. He may not, as unvalued persons do, carve for himself, for on his choice depends the safety and health of this whole state, and therefore must his choice be circumscribed into the voice and yielding of that body whereof he is the head. In other words, okay, fine, let's give Prince Hamlet the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he does love you. Maybe he is serious about you, but remember, he's the prince, so who he ends up marrying isn't going to be totally up to him. He might have to, as was the custom in the time the play is set, and even in Shakespeare's own time, a prince might not be free to marry for love, but might be obliged to marry a princess from a foreign country to secure a peace treaty or something. So, okay, maybe Hamlet loves you, but remember, it's not going to be totally up to him who he marries. So be careful. Now, this relates to a question that students often have, which is why did Shakespeare write so often about kings and princes and dukes and etc., people with these official hereditary titles? Now, it is not, as some haters try to argue these days, it is certainly not that Shakespeare thought these people were actually better than everyone else. I mean, the concept of kingship, royalty, hereditary nobility is viewed with great skepticism, is deconstructed quite skillfully in any number of Shakespeare's works. Rather, in addition to, I suppose, the more pedestrian concern of selling tickets, of putting asses in the seats with plays about royalty, especially in the history plays, historical English royalty, that was especially early on in Shakespeare's career a way to simply to sell tickets and make money, which he needed to do. But also, even in a play like this, which is about made-up royalty, it's a way to attach more drama, more import to the series of events, to have more riding on what's going on. Right, the fate of a royal family is not just the fate of those people, but how stable the entire country is riding on what ends up happening with these few people. Plus, those people as individuals have to deal with a greater amount of responsibility, a greater amount of obligation, of expectation, of being told what to do, ironically, right, even than regular people do. Now, certainly it is accurate to call such people, quote unquote, privileged, as we would do today. That's fine. That's true. That's a factual statement. But I think what Shakespeare was most interested in about such people is the irony of the fact that in some ways being in a position of such privilege meant that they were less free, ironically, than regular people were. A prince, as is explicitly stated in this speech here in 1.3, is not free as a normal person that nobody cares about would be to marry for love, but might have to marry due to some royal obligation. That brings us back to a theme that was denotatively, word for word, introduced in the very closing lines of the first scene of 1.1. This division between loves and duty that we've heard talked about twice now, right, in the closing lines of 1.1 and of 1.2. Needful in our loves, fitting our duty at the end of 1.1, and then the exchange of our duty to your honor, your loves as mine to you, in the closing lines of 1.2. So here we have in Laertes's hypothetical about what Hamlet's desires might be versus what his eventual obligations as a prince might be, speaking to this divide between loves and duty again. Then weigh what loss your honor may sustain, he continues, if with too credent ear you list his songs, or lose your heart or your chaste treasure open to his unmastered importunity. In other words, don't lose your virginity to him. Because this is set a long time ago when losing your virginity to someone to a man you then didn't end up marrying was considered this big deal. Now, of course, people, one of the many things about the play that people love to speculate on is whether Laertes's advice to his sister here is too little too late, and whether Hamlet and Ophelia had, or should be assumed to have, quote unquote, gone all the way at some point before the play started. How serious they had been. Some film versions do make this explicit by showing them in bed together in memories or in flashbacks. That is certainly one way you can take things, and it may even become whether we take it that way or not might become very, very important later on, based on how we interpret certain things that come up later in the play that I'm not going to spoil right now. But the question of did Hamlet and Ophelia have sex before the play started is something that gets introduced here and that we want to file away and hang on to for later. Be wary then, best safety lies in fear. Youth to itself rebels, though none else near. Laertes closes when he finally shuts up in, let's be fair, some of his best lines. Youth to itself rebels, though none else near. In other words, young people are so obsessed with breaking rules that they'll break rules in a way that ends up hurting themselves just for the sake of breaking a rule. A fair criticism of young people. Though their dad Polonius will have an equally fair criticism of old people to match these lines coming up towards the end of Act 2, Scene 1, so stay tuned for that. Characteristically, Ophelia's response to her brother is much shorter, but quite pointed. Good my brother, do not as some ungracious pastors do, show me the steep and thorny way to heaven, she begins around line 45, whilst like a puffed and reckless libertine himself the primrose path of dalliance treads and recks not his own reed. In other words, don't make big speeches to me about how to behave myself and hypocritically violate your own advice by not behaving yourself when you're away at college. "Oh, fear me not," he responds. But then their dad, Polonius, enters to deliver the speech that is the centerpiece of Act One, Scene Three, containing certainly all of the scene's most famous lines, and several of the play's most famous lines as well. In the advice to his son, beginning with "and these few precepts in thy memory look thou character," around line 58. Now, many of the pieces of advice here have since become proverbial. Now, how seriously in context we are supposed to take them is very much an open question. Whether this is actually good advice or whether it is empty, hypocritical, pompous advice that the audience was intended to be chuckling at. Whether, in short, it is very, very questionable whether William Shakespeare himself intended these to be actual pieces of advice that anyone should be paying attention to outside of context here. "Give thy thoughts no tongue, nor any unproportioned thought his act," Polonius begins. In other words, don't let anybody know what you're really thinking, right? Give thy thoughts no tongue, and don't do anything that is going to make you stand out, nor any unproportioned thought his act. And that idea of not doing any acts that are unproportioned, that are unusual or unbalanced. We're reminded a little bit of the new king's obsession, or Claudius's obsession with balance. Wisest sorrow, one auspicious and one drooping eye, back at the beginning of 1.2. So we're starting to hear Polonius as another one of the, though he is not quite as evil a character as we end up realizing that Claudius is. He is still, all things considered, one of the quote-unquote bad guys, but there are, of course, degrees of bad guy. Exactly how bad we do or don't think Polonius is will become important later. But we are seeing a pattern here with the negative characters are a little too obsessed with balance, with normalcy, with common sense, a trait that intellectuals in the mold of Prince Hamlet object to about such people even to this day. Be thou familiar, but by no means vulgar. In other words, don't try to show off with too many big words, but don't curse a blue streak either. Another idea of balance, normalcy, fitting in. Those friends thou hast in their adoption tried, grapple them unto thy soul with hoops of steel, but do not dull thy palm with entertainment of each new-hatched, unfledged courage. In other words, it's better to have a few close friends that you can really trust than to try to be Mr. Popular and have 400 friends, be a friend collector, as we would say today. Now here's some very dad advice that any young man, even 400 years later, will recognize. Beware of entrance to a quarrel, but being in, bear it that the opposed may beware of thee. Lines 65 through 67. In other words, don't fight because fighting is wrong, but if you do fight, win. That is one of the, for anyone who's most interested in, as many people are today, gender roles, gender stereotypes, expectations of the characters based on gender in this play, and it is one of Shakespeare's best plays for that sort of analysis. That's one of the great lines in the whole thing, right? On the one hand, don't fight. Fighting is wrong. It's bad. Don't do it. But on the other hand, your entire worth as a man is measured by how good you are at fighting. So don't fight. It's bad. But at the same time, be good at fighting. Otherwise, you're not a real man. Beware of entrance to a quarrel, but being in, bear it that the opposed may beware of thee. So that the hypocritical advice that men get, just as the, I suppose, female equivalent would be, what we were just hearing Laertes say to Ophelia, and what we will in a moment hear her dad Polonius echo. um, don't have sex, it's bad, but at the same time, be attractive because society is going to judge you as a woman based on whether people want to have sex with you. All right, so we're getting in terms of it's a great scene from start to finish for gender roles and gender-based expectations because we get the society's core hypocritical advice to young men: don't fight. It's bad, but at the same time, your entire worth as a man is judged by how good you are at fighting. And what society says to young women: don't have sex. It's wrong, but at the same time, your worth as a woman is going to be measured by how sexually attractive you are. So, in terms of the concept of madness, of being driven crazy, which is going to become important, more increasingly important as we continue. We're seeing the seeds planted here of how society drives boys crazy with hypocritical advice about violence and drives girls crazy with hypocritical advice about sex. Continuing. Costly thy habit as thy purse can buy, but not expressed in fancy. Rich, not gaudy, for the apparel oft proclaims the man, which has turned into our modern expression, the clothes make the man, something that you occasionally hear people giving as serious advice, even though I think it's pretty clear in context we are supposed to be laughing at the guy who says it. Especially since he continues, and they in France of the best rank and station are of the most select and generous chief in that. In other words, they're going to judge you in France based on how well you dress. So make sure you dress well. Now, listen to the nature of the advice that's being given here. We might expect a wise authority figure, certainly with today's ethics, to say something like, well, they're going to judge you by how well you dress where you're going, but don't pay any attention to them because anybody who judges you based on how you dress isn't really your friend, right? That would be the good advice today. For Polonius, the good advice is they're going to judge you based on how well you dress, so make sure you dress well. So when he finally gets up to the culminating and the most famous line, "To thine own self be true," in line 78, we can conclude, I think, pretty safely that it does not mean, just be yourself, as so many people appear to think it means when they quote it out of context today. You're always hearing people, support, as William Shakespeare wrote, "To thine own self be true." Well, remember, as with any Shakespearean quote, unless I suppose you're quoting the sonnets, it's not William Shakespeare speaking as William Shakespeare, but Shakespeare putting words into the mouth of one of his characters. It doesn't necessarily mean that Shakespeare himself agrees. It's an eternal question among Shakespeare buffs, whether there are any places in the plays where we can assume that through the mouths of one of his characters or another, Shakespeare is actually giving us his own opinion. Any place in the plays where we can assume that the voice we are hearing is Shakespeare speaking as himself. One of the top candidates for such a speech occurs later in this play, specifically Hamlet's advice to the actors at the beginning of Act 3, Scene 2, but more on that later. So, remember, "To thine own self be true" is not something William Shakespeare said so much as it is something Polonius said. And since Polonius is the guy saying it, in the context of this speech, it almost certainly does not mean be yourself. In fact, it appears to mean, judging by the context, something very nearly the opposite of that. Something more like, look out for number one, do what you have to do to get ahead and screw everybody else. Something very, very different from, be yourself or express yourself. We are contrasting it, I think. We are being pushed pretty hard to contrast this speech with what we've heard so far from the main character, from Prince Hamlet himself. In his first speech of more than one line, a couple of pages into the previous scene, 1.2. We had his whole seems, madam, nay, it is, I know not seems. 'Tis not alone my inky cloak, good mother, nor customary suits of solemn black, etc. These indeed seem for their actions that a man might play, but I have that within which passeth show. In other words, with me, what's on the outside matches what's on the inside. What you see is what you get. These pieces of advice from Polonius to his son in 1.3 are pretty diametrically and intentionally, I think, the opposite of that. Don't let anybody know what's on the inside. Just, say what everybody else is saying, do what everybody else is doing. And this does amount to, from a certain point of view, being true to thine own self, because it is how you will, in today's terms, get money. It is how you will, get that promotion, make those connections. So we can certainly, since his advice is being contrasted with Hamlet's obsession with openness and with honesty in the previous scene, we can intuit, okay, well, we're not supposed to like this Polonius guy, but in all fairness, I suppose Hamlet is a prince and doesn't have to worry about getting a job. It is, easier to strut around always letting everybody know exactly what you really think if you don't have to worry about getting a job. Polonius and his kids are not in as privileged a position. Laertes is going to have to worry about making connections and getting ahead in life in the same way that the rest of us have to. So this advice, perhaps not as philosophically noble as what we've heard so far from Prince Hamlet, but certainly more pragmatic. Okay, so Polonius finally shuts up. Laertes gets on the boat. He's off to college in France. He'll be back much later after some stuff happens. Polonius then turns to his daughter Ophelia, who reluctantly confesses to her dad that what she and her brother were talking about just before he entered was something touching the Lord Hamlet. Polonius, this apparently already being on his mind, demands, "What is between you? Give me up the truth," in line 98. Ophelia tries to protest that nothing, truthfully or not, tries to protest that nothing inappropriate, nothing untoward has been going on. He hath, my lord, of late made many tenders of his affection to me, importuned me with love in honorable fashion. In other words, Prince Hamlet has been a perfect gentleman. He's actually serious about me. And Polonius does not believe it. Springes to catch woodcocks, he calls it all, assuming just as Ophelia's brother Laertes had done, that she is being taken advantage of, being led on by Prince Hamlet, and needs the interference of her male relatives to be saved from romantic disaster. I do know, Polonius tells his daughter at line 115, I do know when the blood burns how prodigal the soul lends the tongue vows. In other words, I know what young guys are like. I was a young guy myself once. They'll say anything to get you into bed. He'll promise you anything when he's horny, but as soon as he's satisfied, suddenly that promise will change. Now, what I think of, interestingly, when I read these lines, in terms of, as we were just discussing, contrasts between stuff Polonius says in this scene and stuff we heard Hamlet say in the previous scene. There's a contrast here between Hamlet's famous expression, "Frailty, thy name is woman," about his mother. In his first soliloquy, in the to solid flesh speech, Hamlet was disgusted and disappointed by how quickly his mother's mind, or his mother's heart, take your pick, seemed to change. When his dad was alive, she should hang on him as if increase of appetite had grown by what it fed on, and then within a month, ere those shoes were old with which she followed my poor father's body. Here she is married to some other guy. Now, Hamlet took this as emblematic of the gender and saying, oh, women are so frail, to use his word, incapable of keeping constant, of keeping their promises. But here we have in the next scene a man admitting, nah, let's be honest, it's really men who are like that. I do know when the blood burns how prodigal the soul lends the tongue vows. Which gender is it that's really worse at keeping their promises to love someone forever? Certainly with reference to the context, the woman in question, Gertrude, the queen in the previous scene, started loving someone else after her husband died. Here we're talking about men ceasing to love someone immediately after getting them in bed. Which way of being is actually more frail. Polonius doesn't mean to make us think of this. After all, he didn't overhear what Hamlet was saying in the previous scene. The only people in the play who've heard both speeches are us, the audience. So it's for us to put two and two together. In short, I would not, in plain terms from this time forth, have you so slander any moment leisure as to give words or talk with the Lord Hamlet. So the scene ends with Polonius putting his foot down and saying, that's it, I forbid you to see Hamlet anymore. End of story. And Ophelia, not having much choice, responds with a meek, I shall obey, my lord. Now, we, the audience, know that the last thing on Hamlet's mind right now is his love life. He's you'd only just heard in the previous scene that his dad's ghost has been flying around and is hoping to hear what his dad's ghost, if it really is his dad's ghost, has to say. We'll finally get to that in the next two scenes. But we don't want to steamroll right past the importance of what we are getting in 1.3. It's not a lot of stuff that's immediately recognizable as important if it's our first time through the play, right? The main thing that's on our mind here is Hamlet and his dad's ghost. But a lot of this is foreshadowing of stuff that's going to become important later, but also emblematic of the role of women in this very let's face it, male-dominated play. One of the things that we, I think, all things considered, if you can only read one Shakespeare play, Hamlet is, by most measures, his best work. But unfortunately, one of the things it lacks is something that Shakespeare did so well elsewhere so many times. Strong female characters, great female role models, Juliet, Rosalind, Cleopatra, etc. We have only two female parts in this play, Gertrude and Ophelia, and though both are famous characters, when we add up the lines, it can be shocking to realize how little the two of them actually talk. Ophelia has slightly more lines than Gertrude does, but both have less than 200, fewer than 200 lines. Horatio actually has more lines than either Gertrude or Ophelia does. The role of women in this play seems largely to be about reacting to what the male characters, who do have a tendency to go on for a bit, reacting to what the male characters say. And this points to one of the main differences between coming to Shakespeare, as a text that we read, right? You're thinking of Shakespeare as books, right? As essentially a dramatic poem where different lines are attributed to different characters, versus as something that we see in a play or in a film. This scene is a great example. Ophelia says the least in this scene. She has barely 20 lines in it. Her brother and her dad both talk way more. But in terms of, what we would call today screen time or stage time, Ophelia is the only one who's on stage the whole time in 1.3, right? First, it's her and her brother. Then their dad comes in and it's all three of them. Then her brother leaves and it's just her and her dad. So even though she speaks the least, Ophelia is the only one who's on stage the whole time in the scene. And when we talk about translating stage to film, certainly in most movie versions, a lot of what we're seeing in this scene is, close-ups of Ophelia's face, even though one of the male characters might be the one talking, where thinking about her, what we're paying attention to is not what the two dudes in the scene are saying, so much as how Ophelia is reacting to it. This is a great scene for being reminded of the difference between the discrepancy between who has who has the most lines in a particular scene does not necessarily automatically equal or is not automatically the same thing as what character are we paying the most attention to, or what character is in one way or another elevated as or made out to be the most important in that scene. Okay, well, I'm sure you're all anxious for the ghost. We'll be seeing him again in just a minute for Act 1, Scene 4.